Exploration is the driving force of open world games. The best open worlds encourage players to be curious and explore every nook and cranny to truly get the most out of their experience. They generate a sense of wonder in the player, making them constantly guess what else the world has to offer. And recently there have been a ton of open world games, especially in the AAA space. But I want to talk about two that stand out. One is a beloved company's first attempt at making an open world that seemingly took the internet by storm on its release, and another that was made by a company that has built their entire identity on the concept, and yet it missed the mark in the eyes of the public. Elden Ring is praised for masterfully blending open world exploration with From Software's dynamic combat style, while Starfield has been criticized ad nauseum for being lifeless and boring. But I want to take a closer look at both games' systems and how they handle the concept of an open world and answer the question, what makes Starfield's exploration so boring and Elden Ring's so fulfilling? And to do that, we need to examine both games' respective exploration loops. But first, let me describe what that actually is. An exploration loop is a core three-step cycle that most open world games follow. First, the player enters a zone, then they explore the zone, then they get rewarded. Rinse and repeat this loop over a large map, and you have the skeleton of an open world game. There are of course some titles that like to deviate, but pretty much any open world title will follow this core gameplay loop to some extent. And as long as at least one part of the loop is designed to be engaging, the player will have some reason to keep playing. But you want to make that whole exploration loop as engaging as possible. And the beauty of it all is that there is no single definitive way to make your exploration loop interesting. Some games have zones that are fascinating on their own and will entice you to explore them. This is typically done by making the worlds visually striking in some way, and this isn't just about graphical fidelity, but environmental storytelling, in-game lore, and simply appealing to the player's natural sense of wonder. Other games make the very process of exploration exciting. This is probably the hardest thing to do, but I've seen some games do it by making the movement fluid or making the very act of getting from point A to point B more engaging. But most developers just make it such that you're not getting the full experience when traversing vast distances with your mind turned off, and actually have to look at what's going on your screen. And finally, the rewards aspect. Even if the zones and exploration process are interesting and fulfilling on their own, games still need to reward the player for their curiosity and their time. This is to ensure that the hours that they spend in the game feel meaningful. And going back to Elden Ring and Starfield, both of these titles have a unique exploration loop that encourages the player to travel across the worlds that their devs have created. But that's where their similarities end. The truth is, every part of Elden Ring's exploration loop is designed to be engaging, from the rewards to the experience to the world itself, while exploration in Starfield is seemingly designed to be like a chore. And to back this claim up, we're gonna need to take a look at how both of these games handle all three parts of the exploration loop, starting with the rewards. Basic psychology states that if you're rewarded for a behavior, you'll be more likely to repeat that behavior. The better the reward, the more likely you are to repeat. And Elden Ring's reward system for exploration is perfect for getting players hooked into the game. We saw this during the game's launch when nobody could put it down, and it was seemingly the biggest title on the internet. And if you take a look at its reward system for exploration, it's easy to see why this game is so addicting. See, most open world games reward you for exploring. Usually this is done through awarding the player with currency, loot, an interesting interaction, or any combination of the three. But games also tend to have unique rewards for exploration. These are rewards that are difficult or impossible to acquire with the game's currency. Thus, the only way to get them is through exploration and interacting with the game's systems. These are boons that are specific to the title that you're playing and enhance your experience when playing said game in some way. Looking at the last two major Bethesda releases, Skyrim has word walls that give you some special power, Dragon Souls needed to unlock them, and the unique loot like Dragon Priest masks. Fallout 4 has settlement POIs, which allow you to set up a settlement in an area once you've cleared it from enemies. There are also fusion cores which let you utilize power armor, and while you can buy those from vendors, it's more economic to just go exploring for them, at least in the early to mid game, and there are also bobbleheads and magazines that grant minor extra bonuses. And even when you look at other open world titles, The Witcher 3 rewards you for exploration by giving you access to cooler gear from different Witcher schools, which tend to be better than the randomly generated pieces that come up throughout the world, places of power to empower your science temporarily or permanently if you have the appropriate perk, and recipes for various decoctions and oils to help you when you're witchering. Horizon Zero Dawn has a ton of collectibles, but also special power cells that are needed to unlock the best armor set in the game. And Red Dead Redemption 2 gives multiple meaningful interactions with random NPCs, but also rewards you for exploration by granting you access to different breeds of wild horses and lets you hunt to upgrade your gear, which is a requirement to get things like the ever-important Legend of the East Satchel and legendary animal gear. And then you get to Elden Ring and you'll realize that some of the best parts of the game are only found via side content. I'm talking about unique weapons that are both novel and useful. Some are entirely build defining. This also includes items needed to upgrade them, spells and incantations that players can use if magic is their preferred playstyle, different ashes of war to vary your techniques and offer up new approaches to combat encounters, spirit ashes of different kinds to lend you aid whenever you need them, golden seeds and sacred tears to increase flask count and flask recovery respectively, entire quest lines that decide what happens when you end the game, and even the boss fights themselves can be their own reward just because they're so dang fun. Elden Ring gives you so many rewards for exploring that you're missing out by not venturing into the unknown. And this is even more enhanced when you go in completely blind and have no idea what you're going to get every time you beat a boss, open a chest, or enter a new zone. Limgrave alone is densely packed with things to do. The same goes for other areas in the lands between like Stormvale, Raya Lucaria, and Caelid. Elden Ring immediately hooks you with these amazing early zones, emphasis on early, I'll talk more about that later, that just have so much content constantly being thrown at you. When you're going in blind or haven't touched the game in a long time, you want to check out every crevice of the map because there might be a catacomb or a cave that could have a useful talisman or cool new weapon waiting for you. And the nice thing about Elden Ring's weapon system is that while you'll never use most of the weapons, almost all of them are viable if you want to use them and know how to play the game. Sure, there are some that are just straight up better than others, but that doesn't mean you can't clear the game with your trusty club or great axe. And this system makes runes, the game's currency, feel more like an afterthought. While they are useful for buying items, upgrading gear, or acquiring Ashes of War, and of course, leveling your character, the game makes you feel like they're just a bonus reward, with the real reward being the fun new toys to play with. Runes are fun and all, but if you're playing the game for the first time and have no set build in mind, you'd rather want to see what crazy wacky weapon or Ash of War you're able to find next. And by making these interesting and impactful exploration rewards, Elden Ring encourages players to explore what the lands between has to offer. Meanwhile, Starfield's exploration is often touted as boring, but I think it goes beyond that. It's not just the exploration itself, but it's how the game rewards players for exploration that is flawed. To understand why, let's take a look at Starfield's loot system. The game defines gear into 5 separate tiers: base, calibrated, refined, advanced, and superior, which can only be found on spacesuits, helmets, and packs. Each tier has a higher damage/armor value than the last. Annoyingly, there's no visual distinction between different tiers of gear, so you'll have to be on the lookout for the next tier modifier. And unfortunately, you aren't able to upgrade gear into the next tier. So once you're at a level where enemies start dropping the next tier of items, it's optimal to just replace your arsenal. Otherwise, you'll just be gapped by raw numbers. And at some point, you really do have to replace your weapons, simply because enemy health bars will be so big that you'll run out of reserve ammo before you're even able to finish them off. The big flaw with this system is that it fundamentally makes early game loot pretty useless in the grand scheme of things. And if early game loot sucks and is just going to be obsolete anyway, there's very little point to exploring before you get to the later levels. Especially since, as a Bethesda title, the game is easy enough as is. But the game also has a revamped Fallout 4 legendary system. Instead of elite enemies dropping weapons with 1 legendary trait, Starfields can have up to 3. So these elite enemies will drop a gun or armor piece with 1 to 3 special traits. And granted, most of them are actually quite interesting. Weapons will have a chance to deal elemental damage, deal extra damage to enemies at full health, and even fire explosive rounds from time to time. Meanwhile, spacesuits, helmets, and packs can grant things like extra resistances, increased carrying capacity, and reduced oxygen consumption, just to name a few examples. Unfortunately, like Fallout 4, the traits that you do get depend entirely on your luck, and this is designed such that on an average playthrough, you're gonna have to go through a lot of POIs and kill a ton of elites just to get a weapon or armor piece that fits your build, let alone one with godlike rolls. This is an inherently grindy system that encourages visiting as many POIs as possible to improve your chances of getting a good drop. And unlike Elden Ring where the loot locations are static, the weapons are always randomized. You never know what you're going to get. But here's the thing, as you progress through a game, you'll start to gravitate towards a certain build and you will want to know where to find certain things. But because loot locations in Elden Ring are static, it means eventually you're going to find whatever it is you need after enough exploration. But because legendary guns in Starfield are gated behind RNG, you're forced to fight the same enemies in the same POIs over and over again until you get lucky. And this system works for Fallout 4 because you can at least scale your gear with you as you progress through the game with upgrading. So if you get a god roll on a legendary weapon, congratulations, you found your forever gun. However, when you combine the luck-based legendary gear system with the tiering system, exploration becomes unrewarding, at least early on. Because you are encouraged to explore POIs and fight elites to get lucky and find interesting gear, but at the same time, unless you're already at the higher levels, you know that you're going to have to replace whatever you find because no amount of god rolls will outweigh the stats difference of going from one tier to the next. And this is an inherently grindy loot system that you would expect to find in an MMO or a looter shooter. Elden Ring lets you scale your weapon with you as you progress through the game. So those hook claws that you find in Stormveil that you want to keep using just because they look cool can still be a part of your endgame build 30 hours later. Meanwhile, in Starfield, at some point, you're just gonna have to drop your gun eventually, even if it took you 3 hours to find it. This is a grindy system that was seemingly done to try and pad playtime and force the player to explore in an effort to replace their gear. There's a difference between giving players access to cool new gear through exploration versus forcing the players to drop their old ones just because they're no longer viable from a numbers perspective. Why would a player go out and explore to get loot that's just going to be obsolete anyway? And to be fair, Bethesda's previous titles also had this, where special and unique items would be based on your level, and if you get a weapon when you're not at the highest level for the reward, you're kinda just stuck with a weak version of that thing for the rest of the game. But this is a seriously flawed system. By design, it encourages the player to put off some of the cooler, more interesting quests and quest lines until they're higher level in the name of balancing. I don't understand how Bethesda looked at this and not only decided that it was still good, despite there being a ton of complaints against it as well as mods to rework its implementation, but also made them scale it up to the rest of the game. But the worst part is that these special weapons and armor are the main reward for exploration. But most of the time, you'll end up selling it just because it's either not as good as what you currently have, doesn't fit your build, or you just rather exchange it for credits. And that's the issue. The vast majority of Starfield's loot ultimately devolves into credits. Gun you can't use, just sell it for credits. Piece of armor that doesn't fit your build, just sell it for credits. For the people that have made it this far into the video and haven't played Starfield, did you know that this game has a contraband system? Every now and then you'll stumble across illicit goods in your interstellar travels. Can you turn it into the authorities in exchange for a small boost with a faction? No. The only use that contraband has in Starfield is to sell it for credits. You can't pick it up and turn it into the UC and be a good guy. In fact, you're better off not picking it up at all. Otherwise, you'll be unable to enter most inhabited star systems unless you have specific perks or ship parts. Post-launch, the game even added a new currency system, Astra, along with the Trackers Alliance faction. And what does Astra do? You can redeem it to get random weapons and armor like the ones you get from adventuring and killing elites. And if you don't like it, you can just sell it for credits. Starfield is completely devoid of meaningful rewards that don't just devolve into getting more credits. When you clear a point of interest, you don't get any dragon shouts waiting for you at the end, nor fusion cores that let you stay in the power armor a bit longer. You get credits and a bunch of loot that you'll probably just also end up selling for credits. But Elden Ring doesn't have this issue, at least not to the same extent. Sure, most weapons or spells or ashes of war go unused in a build, and you can sell the ones that you don't need. But those aren't the only things that you can find while you're exploring. Golden seeds give you more flasks, sacred tears typically found in church buildings allow you to regenerate more health and faith points, stone sword keys can allow you to enter exclusive areas, fragments of the map that you can collect so you can see where you actually are, different effects for your physic flask to give you different buffs based on what you choose, and you can even argue that boss fights themselves are the reward in their own right. And this is something that Starfield is fundamentally missing from an exploration standpoint. It doesn't have a loot system that necessitates you to go out and see what the world has to offer, that doesn't just devolve into selling for credits. I mean, technically there are these magazines that give you minor bonuses like in Fallout, but can you really compare a one-of-a-kind weapon that unlocks an entirely new playstyle to a permanent 5% reduction to all fall damage in a game that gives you a jetpack? But the most frustrating thing is that they have the opportunity right there with the artifacts and starborn powers. But instead, they're the focus of the main quest, and thus the game tells you exactly where to go and how to find them. But at that point, you're not exploring anymore, you're just chasing map markers. And that's why Starfield's exploration rewards just feel like they suck. It's just another way to get more money. But to be completely fair, the best part of Starfield is a massive credit sink. And I'm talking about the shipbuilding. Building your own spaceship in Starfield is genuinely amazing, even if the process of going from manufacturer to manufacturer is a tedious one. Building the custom spaceship of your dreams is the space adventure wish fulfillment that Starfield promised, and it delivers. But then the issue is that exploration devolves into a chore that you get paid to do so you have enough money to afford a nice ship. And that just doesn't work, especially when one of the quest lines in the game straight up gives you a shit ton of credits. But good rewards aren't the only way to make the exploration process engaging. Most open world games are designed with some kind of point of interest system. These are areas on the map that you're encouraged to check out. And usually there's something interesting about them, and they're waiting for you to investigate them. By checking out these POIs, you'll gain access to all kinds of things. Some grant you access to traders, whom you can unload some of your junk on. Other POIs give you a radiant quest to check out another place. But the most interesting points of interest are dungeons, caves, abandoned buildings, and the like. These tend to have enemies in them and generally reward you for venturing through until the end. And the points of interest in Elden Ring always offer a unique experience, so it's usually worth it to investigate them, while Starfield's will eventually get stale. That's because the POIs in Elden Ring are handcrafted. And while textures and layouts can be repeated, Elden Ring diversifies the dungeon crawl experience by mixing up enemies and enemy placements. So when you're exploring a dungeon in the game, you don't really know what's going to be waiting for you on the other side, unless you've already checked it out in a previous playthrough. A cave could just have some wolves, but it could also have more dangerous enemies like imps or missile-firing shrimp people. Some even have just a single mob boss or mini-boss waiting for you to face them. And admittedly, on repeat playthroughs, these do get tedious to check out, but when going in blind, you want to see what these places have to offer. And then we get to Starfield's POI system. And contrary to what a lot of people think, the points of interest in Starfield actually are handcrafted. It's just that they're randomly placed across the settled systems. And the game randomly scatters these points of interest from a pool of about 120. So if you play the game long enough, you'll find that a lot of these locations repeat, with the only differences between points of interest of the same kind being the loot that awaits you within and the type of human enemies you face, whether they're generic spacers, Crimson Fleet, Ecliptic Mercenaries, or Varun Zealots. And by the way, they're all humans with guns, thus they all fight like humans with guns. There's no meaningful variation in their combat behaviors, and the only difference I can tell that they have is in the weapons that they use. Otherwise, they might as well all be space bandits with guns. So not only are the points of interest repeating in Starfield, they also have zero meaningful variation. And these points of interest are literally copied and pasted. Enemies sit on the same chairs, stand in the same spots, just waiting for you to kill them. And not only does this make the exploration of these POIs repetitive, but it also hurts your immersion. Seriously, why do all of these cryogenics labs or robotics labs or mines have the exact same layout across different planets? And this repetitiveness kills curiosity. If you already know what to expect when entering a POI, why would you go check it out? Just because you want the loot? Well, you're gonna sell it for credits anyway. And do you know what you call a task that's simple, repetitive, and mundane? A chore. Bethesda made exploration in Starfield, a game whose entire premise is about exploring space, a chore. And this is alarming considering that Bethesda already had a really good formula for exploration. And that's to throw everything at the kitchen sink at the player while they're out and about. I mean, if you've played their previous titles, you'll know what I'm talking about. In games like Skyrim or Fallout 4, if you go from point A to point B, you'll also see points C, D, and E, and you'll have some random encounter thrown at you for good measure. And this formula is what made exploration in the older Bethesda titles so much more engaging. I'm not gonna say that Bethesda invented this formula, but they mastered it and became a titan of the industry with it. And we see this kind of map design philosophy in Elden Ring. Try riding 5 minutes in Limgrave, the first zone in the game, without having anything thrown at you. The area is so incredibly dense dense with enemies, overworld bosses, important NPCs, and points of interest. Simply going from the first to the third grace sites, you can meet a merchant, face the tree sentinel, and fight a bunch of soldiers, also explore a cave with some minor loot, and a mist wall with an optional boss. Then the game advises you to enter the gate, but if you explore the opposite direction, you'll find even more enemies, riders, giants, and huge mobs of soldiers, weapons and chests, ashes of war, more points of interest, and even a talking shrub. This is From Software rewarding you for being curious, for asking, what happens if I don't want to do what the game tells me to? And to add to all of that, the game also has meaningful differences depending on the in-game time of day. For example, overworld bosses that appear once the in-game time is set to night. So if you really want to be thorough, you can check areas both during the day and nighttime to see how the world reacts. This is an interesting design decision because it means that the player has to be intentional and mindful as they explore the world. The game rewards players for not just chasing map markers, and rewards you for engaging with exploration. Because if you just run straight to the next objective, you could very easily miss out on a ton of things. Entrances to caves or dungeons, NPCs with unique dialogue and quest lines, scarabs that disappear if you take too long to kill them, and even glowing skulls that when stepped on while you're mounted, drop extra runes for you to use. The game is constantly bombarding you with all kinds of things, and it's FromSoft's way of telling you, keep your eyes on the monitor. Don't ignore the world while you're traveling through the game. And with this dense map design, you're engaged with the world. And that's true for at least the first half of the game, because once you get to places like Mountaintop of the Giants and Consecrated Snowfield, the exploration does take a massive nosedive. And it's for the same reasons that people hate on Starfield. Because Starfield focuses on meaningless size and bloat rather than area density. The game was marketed with over 1,000 planets that you can explore, but when 80% of them have no alien life and maybe 2 to 3 minerals at most, is it even worth exploring them? This leads to the surface of most planets feeling empty and devoid of interesting interaction and just feeling completely forgettable. And to be fair, that's kind of what space is. Most of it is empty and devoid of interesting interaction. But this game was marketed as an adventure, not a chore. So Bethesda tried to gamify planetary exploration by giving us a scanner so we can gather data. But the scanning system is a repetitive, monotonous system that has no meaningful reward. To gather data on a planet, you get a checklist of what you're looking for, namely the planet's natural minerals, alien life divided into flora and fauna if present, and also planetary traits, if any. And these pretty much act as eye candy. They're also randomly generated, so you'll see a lot of them repeated as you traverse the settled systems. And once you've scanned everything there is to scan, the planet or moon marks as fully explored, and you're rewarded with a bunch of XP and the survey data of the celestial body that you just ran around, which we'll talk more about later. And this exploration system for gathering data on a planet or moon is incredibly dumbed down and tedious. To completely scan a species of fauna or flora, you need to scan it 8 times by default. Multiply that by the number of species on the planet and add the number of traits and minerals that you can find, and you've got a serious time sink. Some minerals are also rarer than others, so you'll have to visit certain parts of the planet or enter caves to find them. You can invest perk points into certain skills to make scanning faster, but it's still a slog to get through. The first few planets with alien life will be interesting, but then you start to realize that a lot of the aliens and the flora are reused and just recolored slightly, if ever, have a different drop, or are changed from being peaceful to carnivorous or swarming or something, thus removing the sense of whimsy that you get for looking at alien creatures. Too many aliens in this game are just quadrupedal or are just some kind of bug. They could have gone crazy with some of the alien designs, but a lot of them are just reused. And to be completely fair, Elden Ring is also guilty of this. As you progress through the game, a lot of the enemies that you fought in the early game are just repeated, with some stats buffs or as regular mobs instead of being bosses. And God forbid you have to run through a planet with a coastline and marine life, because then you have to run along the coast waiting for something to spawn. Riveting gameplay, right? Exploring Starfield's planets is really just running around with your scanner out hoping for something to spawn. It's a monotonous, time-consuming task, and I had to put like a podcast in the background or something to not fall asleep while doing this. But there's one thing I do want to praise Starfield Scanner for, and that's the in-game photo mode. Now, I get that most modern games have a photo mode, but what I like about Starfield specifically is that when you take a photo using it, those photos actually get cycled into possible loading screens, so you at least have a bit of incentive to use it, even if you're not a screenshot sniper. This feature is genuinely neat, and Starfield, for all its faults, is still a very beautiful game. I'm not sure if it's the first game to do something like this, but it sure as hell the first game I've played that has this feature. And I for one believe that if a game has a loading screen, this would be a fun way to make them a little less boring, even if Starfield has too many. But people don't play games because they look pretty and want to take screenshots. People play games because they want to interact with fun and interesting systems. And running around with your scanner out hoping for things to spawn is not a fun system. But hey, at least you get the survey data, right? This is information on what the planet or moon has to offer to humanity, and you're helping to contribute to knowledge of the known universe. So what do you do with it in-game? Can you use it to redeem hidden bonuses from Constellation? Does collecting more of it unlock hidden dialogue and quest lines? Does the game at least track your progress for how much survey data you've collected in a meaningful way? No, none of the above. The only use you have for planetary survey data is to sell it for credits. So Starfield reduced the very act of unraveling the mysteries of the universe to yet another way to get credits and experience, which is boring. And that is how Elden Ring rewards exploration and Starfield makes it boring. If you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts down below. That's all for now, and ace out.